Welcome back for part 4 of our 5-part series of videos demonstrating how easy it is to install and configure Customizer Lite. This is David Bell, Senior Development Manager and a member of the squad responsible for the Customizer technology at HCL Software. Today we are looking at changes required to the connections environment to support the use of Nginx for routing requests via Customizer. As in the previous video, there will be a mixture of a few slides plus some live demonstration of the configuration process. Let's get started. The goal of this stage of the implementation is to front-end connections with Nginx so that it can divert requests on specific URI paths requiring customizations to the MW proxy service, while sending other requests directly to connections. Without this separation, the MW proxy service would have to handle every request destined for connections, whether it resulted in a customized HTML response or not. The installation and configuration will be demonstrated, but just before we do, here is a summary of what is required. All of the necessary information is listed in the public Connections Knowledge Center. Just search for Customizer Lite. First, the Nginx server code will be installed with its default configuration, which will be modified to suit the particulars of the environment into which it is installed. It's preferable to have an SSL certificate to allow access via HTTPS, so a certificate needs to be created or an existing one, perhaps from the Connections HTTPS server, reused. Lastly, we'll run a few requests via Nginx to connections to test the basic network connectivity, even though connections has not yet been updated to reference the Nginx hostname. Let's do it.
So I'm here on my customizer machine. Just as a reminder, this is where my customizer services are running under Docker, and I'm going to put Nginx on this same machine. So first thing to do is make sure we have the extended repository installed, which we should already have because we did this in an earlier part of the series. So just make sure that that is set up. And then we can run the Nginx install. Sudo yum install Nginx. And yes. So that is install. If we look in, let's see Nginx, we should see some default configuration files. We'll get to those shortly. To allow access via HTTP and HTTPS, we need to make sure those are allowed through the firewall. So some commands here to enable access. This is using the firewall D service. So we allow HTTP and HTTPS, and we need to reload the firewall rules. So just make sure a browser can hit this service, this machine, port 80, port 443 to connect to Nginx. And to do a quick test of that, we can start Nginx with its default configuration. So if we switch over to our browser and we hit Nginx, what we see there is the HTML and the default user share directory on the OS. And just to prove that is indeed Nginx, if we put something nonsensical, we should get an Nginx response. So Nginx is running on our customizer node. So now let's continue and configure it for customizer. If we want Nginx to respond on HTTPS, we need some kind of certificate. And so for the purposes of the setup here, I am going to create a self-signed certificate using OpenSSL. Command looks like this. And we're going to put the key and the certificate files in a standard place in the for the installation of Nginx. So we have to fill out some information to generate the certificate. So country name, US, state or province, I'm in Washington, locality name, I'm not going to worry about, organization name, it's called HCL. Organizational unit, software, can't type, obviously you'd fill in your values that are appropriate for your organization here. Common name, we call it Customizer01. Email address. And looking at path, etc., PKI, Nginx. We see the server cert, and in the private directory, we'd have the server key file. So now we have a certificate that we can reference inside of the Nginx configuration. So let's go look at the Nginx config. And nginx.conf is the standard configuration file. So let's do sudo. And let's see here, we've got server listening on port 80 by default. I think 443 is disabled by default, so we need to, first of all, uncomment all of these lines to enable port 443. And you see here, this is why I chose those paths for the certificate, because these are the defaults that are already in the configuration file. So our certificate and certificate key files should be properly referenced there. There are some proxy directives that we need to insert. These are in the standard documentation. I'm going to copy and paste them prior to the server block here. And then within the location stanza for the HTTPS server, down here, we need to add some statements to tell Nginx that when it gets a request on HTTPS port 443, what error it should send them. And so I'm going to copy and paste some statements in here. Try and tidy up the formatting a little bit, just to make it a bit more readable. So this is a nested location, which says that if the incoming request URI matches homepage/web or social my contacts, those requests should get forwarded to the MW proxy service on Customizer, which is listening on port 3001 on this machine. And for any other requests, we want to send it on to the IHS server. So the host name of the Connections IHS server here. And as you provide customizations on more URIs, you can modify this first location pattern, regex pattern here to include the additional paths that you want to be proxied through MW proxy instead of direct connections. So that location reference may well change over time. And if the line gets long and unwieldy, you can split it into multiple sections that all still reference the same proxy path directive. One other thing I almost forgot, the requests to Customizer for the JavaScript and CSS files also need to be referenced. Their URI needs to be referenced here. So those requests do in fact go to Customizer for fulfillment. So JavaScript and CSS are all referenced through the file/Customizer specific URI. And without that, the files won't get downloaded. So save that. Once your configuration changes are made, you can actually run the Nginx command with the -t flag, which will check your syntax in the configuration file. It won't necessarily validate that what you put in the commands is correct, but it would at least tell you if you have any syntactic errors like missing braces or parentheses or things like that. Once we've made a change to configuration, we can stop Nginx and start Nginx. And just to check that the requests are being sent to connections, we can hit the Nginx server with the homepage login URL, and what we should see is the homepage login. And if we log in, we should see connections. Now that Nginx is configured, we are going to look at changes to the connections environment. Firstly, we need to be able to access the App Registry client UI and the backend service, so we need to add proxy pass statements into the HTTP server config to forward those requests to the corresponding containers. And now that Nginx is ready to begin handling requests, we need to tell connections it should produce URL links that reference Nginx using the dynamic host property of the configuration. Rather than URLs being constructed based on the connection's HTTP server hostname, we'll tell connections to always use the Nginx hostname instead. If you have a well-known or alias DNS entry for connections, then switching that to pointing to Nginx instead would be desirable, but beyond the scope of this particular video series. It's a good idea to navigate around in connections and make sure that the URL links in connections pages are all referencing Nginx. Lastly, we'll go to the App Registry client UI to set up the Hello World test customization and make sure it is visible in the home page to confirm Customizer is working properly. Just as a reminder, the help documentation here that I'm showing is the page that talks about HTTP server changes and connections dynamic host changes. If you search on configuring Customizer Lite, you should find that. And these are the things that we're going to do in this part of the video. So back on our connections machine, we are going to go to the HTTP server configuration directory, and we are going to edit the conf file. And per the documentation, we need to find out the section here where the HTTPS server is defined, and we need to insert our proxy pass statements. I'm just going to insert them here for both AppReg and the App Registry Service. And the ports that you see here should be familiar from our previous video where we ran the containers and we looked at the port settings. Those same statements also need to go here outside of the if module, and we only need one preserve host. Okay, so save that. And once that is saved, we should be able to go to the bin directory and use the Apache CTL command to do a graceful restart of the HTTP server. Just make sure that is running, looks good. So back to our browser, and a couple of URLs we can hit just to make sure things are wired together. First one is the App Registry Service, and if you're not logged into connections already, it's going to prompt you to log in. What we should see here is the JSON of all of the different service types that are supported in the App Registry. So that means we're talking to the App Registry Service container successfully. Second one is to the App Registry Client UI. if we put that URL here, the app reg apps UI URL, sorry, then we should see the app reg UI, and we don't have any customizations defined yet, so we just see the outline of the UI. But that means everything is hooked together properly. So the last couple of steps here are to update dynamic hosts on the connection server. So let's do that. We need to go to the connections config directory. So let's edit the connections config XML, find the dynamic hosts property, and we need to replace the HTTP and HTTPS versions of the link. So that's better. And HTTPS, so Nginx host name. And we also need to make this true. And save that. And then we need to stop and start the server. So let me copy this. So we use the stop server script to stop the connection services. Now that's stopped, we can restart it. Okay, so connections is restarted. So if we go back to the browser now and go to connections and log in again. What we should see is that the URL links, if they look at the bottom left corner there as I hover, now say Customizer instead of the LCORDO 102 hostname, so that requests followed from links on the pages go through Nginx so that it can decide should those requests be passed to Customizer or not. And the last thing to do then was to check that the customization actually works. So if we go to the app reg UI, so we create a new app, and I'm just going to paste in some JSON for the Hello World customization and save that. And now we see the extension card in the UI, and it is enabled. So if we go back to the home page, if you notice here, it says share something. The customization I just set up is designed to change that text. So if we refresh the page and Customizer is working, we should see, and we do, the modified text. So that's a trivial example, but it proves that Customizer is working and modifying the connections response to inject the item that we want. Just to illustrate this a little bit further, since this is a JavaScript customization, I'm going to filter on JavaScript and refresh the page. And we see here the browser request to get the Hello World custom JavaScript that is referenced in the HTML page. The customizer injected the reference to that, and the browser loads the JavaScript, and the JavaScript runs and modifies the text on the page. That concludes part 4 of this series on deploying Customizer Lite. Now we have a connections environment that can be customized in endless ways. Up next is the 5th and final part of the series, where we'll look at how to turn this basic Customizer Lite setup into a more robust production deployment by using and load balancing across multiple instances of each of the Customizer Lite services. This was David Bell, Senior Development Manager at HCL Software. Goodbye for now, and I look forward to speaking to you again in part 5.